There it is.
All right, welcome everybody. Today I have the privilege of interviewing Ann Nichols. Ann Nichols volunteers and serves with Samaritans Purse. She is a retired nurse, and she recently went to New York City to serve and to help out with COVID-19. So I have some questions for us, and just enjoy this time getting to hear about Ann's trip and service and what's going on over there. Welcome, Ann.
Thank you. Hey, Redeemer.
Ann, tell us about your time over there.
Mm. So, Samaritan's Purse was asked to come and help with COVID in New York City. We had already been asked to go to Italy, Cremona, Italy, and I was on call to go to Italy. I was packed, ready to go, supposed to leave the following week. And then the first wave was already there. They had been there a week. And then typically one team sets everything up and gets things started. It starts admitting patients, and then the second wave comes in for the next 2 to 4 weeks. So I was on the second wave, and then I got a call saying, we've been asked to help in New York City. Are you willing to defer and go there instead? And at first I was kind of disappointed. I really wanted to go to Italy. I don't know why, maybe because I've never seen it, although on a DART, all I ever see is the disaster. I never get to see Bangladesh or, Togo or wherever I'm going. I only get to see the disaster part. So my first thought was, well, I really don't want to go there. And then I had stopped myself, and I always try to be obedient, to the call, whatever the call is. And I immediately thought, well, this came up for a reason. Maybe I shouldn't be trying to make something happen artificially. So I said yes, I would go to New York. So I left very quickly. I think I had 2 days notice, and left to go to New York City. I was going to be on night shifts, which is usual on darts. I've never in my career worked night shifts, but every single dart I put on night shift, which it usually ends up really good.
Can you tell us what
So,
can you tell us what
pardon?
a DART is?
Oh, DART, sorry, terminology. DART is an acronym for Disaster Assistance Relief Team, and it's an arm of Samaritan's Purse. There are several different branches of Samaritan's Purse. World Medical Mission is how I got to Africa, and that's a volunteer position. The DART positions are paid. We get paid a stipend. It's not very much, but it's something, and they cover everything, flights there, everything on the ground, everything we need, hotels. So yeah, this was my third DART with Samaritan's Purse, and fourth travel mission, because I was with World Medical Mission in Africa before this DART. And so I arrived one day, and then I get a very brief tour of not the hot zone, but a tour of the tent city. This was a tent hospital set up, which was a collection of tents. I've been posting maps and pictures and videos of them, so I think most people are familiar with what I'm talking about. But it's actually very historic. It's the first time since the Civil War that medical tents have been in Central Park. It was a very big deal. And it was a big deal because it is the very first U.S. DART that Samaritan's Purse has done. We've never done one in the United States, which had a whole bunch of challenges that some we knew would be a problem, others were caught by surprise. Honestly, don't know if there'll ever be another one because it really was, it was difficult in a lot of ways. So after being oriented and meeting a couple of teammates, I went back to my hotel, unpacked, and went to sleep. because you have to go to sleep to work in the evening. So um, when I turned up for my first shift, it was 6 o'clock in the evening. We had shuttle buses that are Samaritan's Purse rents a bunch of little minivans, and we had our own staff to keep our exposure to other people as little as possible. We couldn't use Ubers, we couldn't use taxis or anything like that. Um, only our hotels, and the hotels actually were closed. The staff, there were 2 people working there, were very grateful because they said that we gave them jobs. All of the hotels closed weeks and weeks and weeks before we got there, and so they were unemployed. There was no housekeeping staff, there was nothing. There was just these 2 people who checked us in at the door. Um, and yeah, they gave us they gave us these rooms for free. The hotel chains gave us free accommodations, and that was why we took up on it. But on a dart, things changed very quickly. So after shift one morning after shift, I was told, pack all your things, we're going to another hotel. So there's always change. Just, you never know what's going to happen. So yeah, the tent hospital, I was familiar with that. I'd done this in Bahamas in a field hospital, and it's exactly the same tents. The layout was a little different, actually very different, because we had a hot zone and a cold zone. So you have to put on all of your PPE. I'm sure you saw pictures of me with all my gear on. And once you're in the hot zone, you don't come out, and nothing else comes out of the hot zone. So you have to be very careful. We don't have access to pockets or anything like that. Our cell phones are in a plastic bag. Infection control is very, very high on the priority list. We're sprayed down with chlorine water at every stage, it seemed like, of taking everything off. And so it was very labor intensive and cumbersome. The weather was very cold. It was 30 degrees a lot of nights. I was there. Very rainy, windy. We had a couple of very windy nights. We were worried about the tents. We had one flood in my tent one night. But they have staff. There's a huge team. It's not just medical teams. There are wash teams that take care of, that's water and sanitation and hygiene. They take care of all the donning, doffing, keeping everything clean, hooking up oxygen tanks, enormous oxygen tanks, because we needed a lot of oxygen for our patients. So that's another reason I love serving with them. They're very well prepared, very organized, detail oriented. Yeah.
One of the questions you get asked often is, did you feel safe?
Yes. Yes, I do get asked that a lot. Mm-hmm. And topmost on people's minds are my physical safety as far as catching COVID. Mm-hmm. Do I feel safe working in that zone? And yes, I did. We had plenty of PPE. Unlike a lot of the hospitals in New York, Samaritans Purse maintains their own warehouses, huge warehouses. It looks like Amazon. And we had plenty of PPE. I felt safe with the precautions that they were taking. Again, it was Ebola precautions, and this was not Ebola. Ebola is spread contact. If you touch a person or sweat or something like that. COVID is very different. It's in that it's a little bit airborne, but it's droplet precautions. So surfaces do keep it, but we were, double gloved, jumpsuits, face shields, N95 masks, goggles. Yeah, there was no square inch of skin showing while we were in the hot zone, which made it hard to move around. And then as far as physical safety with The environment, there's a whole other team, a security team that are constantly working with NYPD. NYPD had police cars all around our site 24 hours a day. It's weird because they leave their lights flashing. They're just parked there, but they leave their lights on all night. So it's flashing blue and red to let people know there are people there. We had a perimeter fence around, and then a privacy fence as we got further into it, so patients could come out to shower when some of them felt well enough. We had shower trailers there, and maintain their privacy. So yeah, we have a lot of security on the ground, and I always feel safe. And a big part, of course, of our mission is it's not just about the medicine. It's about bringing people to Christ, introducing them to Christ, demonstrating Christ to them. Because a lot of people, they've been either sold a lie about what that looks like, or they've never heard it, even in New York City, have never heard the gospel. So in that sense, I always felt safe spiritually. There are Billy Graham chaplains there, van loads of them, and they surround the site. They walk the park, they walk the perimeter, praying over us, praying over the site, over our patients, catching us, if we were out on a break, or every time we came into the site or going out of the site, they pray us in, pray us out. Yeah, it's very well covered.
Yeah, cool. How many beds did the hospital have?
We had, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 patient tents.
Mm-hmm.
And I think our total was 65 at one time. And the ICU had 6, 2, 3, 4, 6 ventilator beds. So we had 6 active ventilators, and then 4 other beds that were just for people who didn't quite yet need to be ventilated, or maybe they were just sick in other ways, needed more intensive monitoring and intensive care. And then my unit, my tent, was called the step down ICU, which was, it wasn't step down at all. I'll explain that in a minute. But my tent, there was me and one other teammate, and then we had someone who was afloat, who would float from tent to tent, and if we needed help, he would come in and help, or she. And my tent had 12 beds. So each of us had, on average, 6 patients. And normally, step down ICU, then we had a men's ward, men's tent, and a women's tent, and then a mixed tent, which with men and women. And then various, pharmacy tent, which was in the cold zone, and then x-ray tent in the hot zone, a lab tent in the hot zone. And normally the progression of patients is as they get, if they get sick from the wards, when they're on the wards and they need more care, they come to the ICU, and then as they're getting better and they need still more careful monitoring than they could get on the wards, then they come to the step down ICU. That's what step down means. In this particular case, this was a step up unit. All of our patients, almost without fail, went to the ICU. Almost all of them. They would either come from the ward to us to ICU, or they would be admitted to step down because they were sick, sicker than usual, or sicker than could be on the wards, meaning they needed a higher oxygen concentration than they could get in the ward tents. And so, yeah, a lot of my patients went to ICU.
What was different about this trip as opposed to other trips to other places that you've done?
I think there were several things that were very different. Again, it was the very first U.S. DART And that presented so many challenges that as a nurse, I did not anticipate. None of us expected what this disease was going to be. We knew it caused pneumonia. We knew it was a respiratory disease, an influenza type disease. And that's what we were all geared up. Doctors, nurses, all of us. This is what we came to do, and we know how to do this. So the big surprise was the day we all got there, a couple of days before we actually took patients to help set the wards up. And while we were there, just talking about protocols, how we were going to do this, we did a Skype call with Italy, with our team in Italy, who had already been there for 2 weeks, and asked them what to expect. And so several of the doctors got on the line and started describing what they were seeing. And we were stunned, just as they had been stunned when they first saw what this disease could do. And all of us were just kind of looking at each other and just realizing this is going to be really hard. This is going to be a lot more difficult than any of us thought, because as it turned out, week after week, more and more, it became like stomping out fires. Things were happening so quickly with our patients, and the admissions were coming sometimes 10, 12 a shift, new patients coming in, and on top of other ones getting sick that were already there and having to be put into my unit or the ICU. There was no time to sit and analyze what was going on, because the things we were seeing were so different from anything anybody had ever seen in their careers. It was really unbelievable. It was so much more than pneumonia, and just trying to be alert. And you're looking for one set of symptoms, increased heart rate or increased oxygen, increased respirations, or having trouble breathing, and then they blow a hole in their lung, a pneumothorax, or they throw a blood clot into their lung or their brain, and there's a brain bleed, or it was crazy. Nobody expected that. When you're looking at influenza, you're expecting a certain set of symptoms, and nobody was expecting these blood clots and all these other strange chest pain, heart attacks. It just felt every single shift like, oh my gosh, what was that? We didn't know how to react, and it left us drained and just silent sometimes. The trips back to the hotel in the morning were mostly silent. We were just so trying to figure out what had just happened. Sometimes we did have those conversations, the two doctors from the ICU would just kind of look at us and say, what was that? Why did that happen? And what could we have done? Is there anything we could have done differently? And the answer was always no. Nobody saw it coming. It was very strange. The patients that you thought were doing really well, at the beginning of the shift, and they'd had a couple of good days, and you thought, wow, this is going well. And then within hours, they're not, and they're in the ICU or on a ventilator. And I can't tell you, every time I got towards the end of the last week there, I just dreaded going in and seeing an empty bed, because often I'd find the death certificate on the desk as I'm tidying up, and I was just always afraid to ask, where did that person go, and most of the time they had either died or gone to the ICU and died. Often I'd go over just to get something from the ICU or ask a question at the ICU, and they were coding my patient that I'd been taking care of the day before. And it was very tiring and wearing. We were all just, the word weary came up a lot. It was beyond tired, just weary. Yeah. So that was very, very different. That I think that's the thing that was the most different about this dart. I didn't expect the amount of death on a daily basis, um, and just not knowing why. Nobody knew why. There were no therapies. There was nothing we could do to help them. There's no medicine. There's no vaccine to prevent it from happening again. There's just nothing but oxygen. That's all we could do. And a lot of times that wasn't enough.
Um, you mentioned something to me in an earlier conversation about the amount of patients that you saw recover. Would you mind sharing a little bit about that?
Yeah, it wasn't a lot. It wasn't a lot. And part of it is because I was on night shift for the majority of time I was there. I think the last 5 days I was there, they switched me over to days. Um, the day shift got to see discharges. We had big cowbells in every tent, and whenever someone was um, discharged, you'd hear all these bells ringing, and it got to New York was so supportive. The people there were just unbelievable. When they heard the cowbells, just people driving down the streets knew what it was, and they'd start honking their horns, and
Mm,
people would be, oh, I'm going to get emotional.
mm,
People would be just stopping on the sidewalk and clapping for them and just rejoicing somebody made it out. Because I seriously doubt in New York City there was anybody who didn't personally know somebody who had died, either a neighbor or a friend or a family member, sometimes multiple family members. The horrible thing was they couldn't see each other.
mm.
They couldn't visit, family members couldn't visit. Once they were in that ambulance, they were gone. And often there was no time to say goodbye. So that was hard. Um, I personally saw two of my patients discharged
Mm.
the last day I was there. And because I was on day shift, um, yeah, two of them went home, and both of them had been in our tent hospital for a month the whole time I was there. And that didn't count the time they'd already spent at Mount Sinai. And
Mm.
then they were, then they came to us because they just didn't have room for them. Um, and they weren't going home well. They went home in an ambulance on oxygen, and they're going to be on oxygen for a long time. The weakness is profound. You can't be in bed for a month and not lose the ability to walk. Sometimes they couldn't raise their arm off the bed. They were so weak, their muscles atrophy. Um, Sometimes they're too weak to eat.
Mm.
So they lose a lot of weight. And um, yeah, two patients. Yeah. A couple more went to the ward. Um, One of them was the elderly gentleman, and he recovered
Mm.
and went back to another nursing home, and he didn't want to go. That's what was
Mm.
that's another thing that was so striking. Our patients often came to us angry that they were in a tent, afraid that they were in a tent. Can you imagine? You're greeted with these people in spacesuits. You can't see them, you can't hear them very well. All you can see are their eyes, and they're in a tent, for goodness sake, in Central Park. We often received patients that had been 5 days in the emergency room on a gurney. There was just no bed anywhere to put them. So um, it was just so overwhelming when they spent that much time with us, day and night. And we pray with them all the time, held their hands, asked them, can we pray with them? Um, Nobody refused.
A
Mhm.
question that you often get asked is kind of what is the average age of folks there?
Yeah. Um, it was kind of all over the place. We had been told elderly and elderly with and younger with comorbidities, meaning they already have heart disease, they've had a heart attack, they have diabetes, they have some kind of underlying COPD, which is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. They already have something that they're sick with and maybe not very well controlled. And so they did not do well at all.
Mm,
Um, but the CDC defines elderly as anybody over the age of 51.
mm,
Well, that's pretty much all our church. A lot of our church is over 51. So if you want to say our church is elderly, yeah, um, a lot of them were my age, or in their 50s, but we got a fair amount of people in their 40s. We had a 27-year-old, a 38-year-old. This is just what I know of in my tent. Um, I don't know about the other tents. Sorry.
and we lost Ann. Just for the record,
Hello.
Ann
Sorry.
Ann called you elderly, not me. Just for the record. Welcome back, Ann.
Awesome. And I'm definitely elderly. So, um, anyway, yeah, they really were all over the place. Absolutely no kids. That doesn't mean to say kids were not impacted in New York City. There was actually I think a 7-week-old or 7-day-old. I think it was a 7-week-old infant died of COVID. Um, and there were other children, I think a 5-year-old. But we never saw those because the pediatric ICU was in Mount Sinai and Beth Israel. And so, yeah, for the most part, it was that age range. And we also had, besides the tent hospital that we were in, Samaritans Purse also staffed, they put a halt to All World Medical Mission, the volunteer arm of Samaritans Purse, and recruited them to come to New York City, doctors and nurses, to staff of Mount Sinai. That's how badly they needed beds. And then another unit in Beth Israel Hospital, and we staffed that also. So yeah, the age range, that was the age range.
Yeah. How else did you see God present with you during your time?
Mm, constantly. I swear that's on every dart. That's the only way any of us make it through. And again, Samaritan's Purse recognizes the importance of that. And so they do everything they can to provide whatever we need, to make, to give us what we need. Um, God's presence was just always there. I think there's something about night shift that's very different from day shift. Day shift tends to be very, very busy with administrative stuff, admissions, discharges. There's a lot of paperwork, a lot of traffic back and forth, moving beds back and forth, people from one tent to the other. Night shift, for the most part, unless somebody goes south, and that sometimes happened, everybody's just in bed, and there's long, long hours with nothing to do. There's no TV. They didn't have books. We didn't have newspapers. They're just laying there. And there's something that happens in all hospitals, but when you're in that kind of state with steady lighting, no windows, just the same lighting all the time, you lose track of day and night as a patient,
Mm.
Um, and so in those long hours, we're still doing assessments, and with 6 patients each, it's still pretty busy as far as keeping an eye on people. If people are going to get worse, they usually do so at night, so you have to be really on your toes, with assessments and making sure that you check in on them. And often they would call us over, or I would go over. I would see particularly a lady crying, um, or somebody having difficulty breathing, and they needed help. They were so weak, they needed help to turn from side to side. And that really helped with breathing also. And so long hours spent rubbing backs, holding hands, trying to change position, trying to make the mask more comfortable, the breathing mask, um, and a lot of time for prayer, and even silent prayer, a lot of silent prayer. Somebody made in the middle of the night, often staff, we're sitting there, just holding hands, sometimes with each other and praying with each other. Somebody made a comment, I think in one of our devotions, that when the Israelites were in the desert all those years and moving from place to place, their church was a tent. The tabernacle was a tent. And it just struck us suddenly that here we are in tents bathed in prayer, surrounded with prayer, surrounded with people all over the world that are praying for us nonstop. And the moment I thought of that, I was just sitting with a patient one night, I thought of that. I remembered that passage in Isaiah 6:1, and it was so just vivid. It was just vivid. Just that scene of the robe of God filling the tent, just that, if you can imagine just the hem of a robe filling the entire tent, that's the bigness, and the enormity of a God, of our God. And it just really, in the middle of a lot of chaos and noise, it just really calmed me to think, yeah, he's here. you know um, the scene where it describes the tent being filled with smoke and this essence, this, you could just feel God, and it was palpable. A lot of times it was palpable. There were so many verses that came to mind like that. One of my favorite things to do, and it was really odd, it sounds odd, was when everybody was asleep and it was quiet, to empty the urinals. There was this long wooden path between the tents that was all lit up to the porta potties that they had in the back just for emptying urinals. And I would just grab, two handfuls of urinals and do this walk. And it was hard to walk weighed down with all this gear. It was hard to breathe sometimes because sometimes I had two masks on. And I was tired, and it was like 2 or 3 in the morning. And I just walked very, very slowly with all these urinals down this path. And I'd be so tired. Sometimes I did it just to stay awake. I was just so exhausted. I just couldn't keep my eyes open. And going out into 30-degree weather when it's raining will do that for you. And so I was just grabbing these urinals and walking. And it occurred to me, I don't know if it was a feeling or just a thought. Again, the vision of the robe, or the picture of the robe filling, the hem of the robe filling the temple. I just had this visual of Jesus walking beside me with his arm around my shoulder, just walking me to the porta potty. Just doing something so basic and, similar to washing feet, just taking care of the simplest of duties. It just brought me a lot of peace, and it made my mind just be quiet and remember, oh yeah, I'm not by myself, I'm not alone. There, yeah, there were many moments like that, many. Those are just the most vivid ones that I can remember.
That's beautiful. Thank you for that insight into your life.
Yeah, it was yeah, and it always just feels such a privilege, to be able to do that. How many people in the world get to travel all over the world and serve completely? Not many people get that opportunity, and I just consider it a privilege.
What was it like to hold people's hands?
Mm-hmm.
Can you describe that a little bit?
Yeah. Um, yeah. It was, um, sometimes it felt difficult because I had 2 layers of gloves. There was no skin to skin contact at all. And in between those layers of gloves is a layer of the fabric of the jumpsuit. So it's really hard to do anything, text or write or anything with 2 layers of gloves and that. But um, it wasn't just skin to skin contact. You can do a lot with your eyes. You can communicate. Even a lot of the patients I couldn't speak with, I didn't know Spanish. We had a large Spanish community in New York. I didn't realize.
Mm.
Ecuador, a lot of people from Ecuador there. Venezuela. Um, it's very much a multicultural city. So to hold hands with somebody that you can't speak their language, um, but you can still communicate a lot with touch, with your eyes, with rubbing shoulders, rubbing their backs, the cots. We didn't have hospital beds; these were cots,
Mm-hmm.
and these are older people like myself. My bones ache, on a cot when I'm camping. Um, they were very sore and tired and needed help. They were very weak, couldn't shift from side to side very well, and so there was a lot of contact of contact and just holding somebody's hand. Um, it's difficult to describe. They're scared. They haven't seen their family in weeks. Sometimes, you know, I don't think any of them have been sick more than a couple of months. Um, they're scared. They are in a strange place. A lot of them asked for prayer. There was the sweetest man. Uh, anyway, I've got a whole list of people I kept on my phone to pray for. All died. Um, but this one gentleman, older gentleman, I think he was speak English, but he was very animated, and he would grab me and pull my hands to his chest and then do this to ask me to pray for him. Um, he was so scared. I think he knew in the end that he was going to die. For a long time, he was hopeful. He prayed a lot. I'd just look over, and he was lying on his cot with his hands raised, his eyes closed, just praying um, to make it. He didn't. The fear was awful, to see that fear in their eyes, to see them struggling for breath and begging, help me breathe, or if they could talk. And knowing there was, very little we were going to do, even with a ventilator. That was the last straw. They would go to the ICU, and I would hold their hands on the way to the ICU, and the doctor would be trying to explain um, what was going to happen. We were going to help them breathe with the tube, but the reality was the New York City statistics, if you went on a ventilator, you had an 89.9% chance of dying. There was no less, what, maybe 10% chance of living after being put on a ventilator, because that was the last thing we could do, and it wasn't doing very much. Mm. So, yeah. But people came to faith. The young man that I sent back, who I'm still in touch with, he got his Bible. We all signed his Bible. He was one that didn't want to go back. He said we were his family, and he had family to go back to. But he was very grateful, and so grateful that he found Christ. And there were a lot of those stories. We rang bells for that too.
Mm.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
I have one last question, and you and I
Mhm.
chatted a little bit earlier. Just people ask you a lot of questions, and a lot of people have this question, and we thought it would be just just helpful for them if we asked you. Um,
Mhm.
is it as bad as we hear?
I get asked that a lot, and my immediate response is it's so much worse than what you're hearing. It is, yeah. It's very frustrating for all of us. Well, it was very frustrating for all of us while we were there to hear people on TV or being interviewed on the local news station. We saw very little of the news. Honestly, we were
Mhm.
so exhausted. We just eat, sleep, and go to work, and work our shift. Um, but we did hear of people saying that, oh, the numbers are inflated and they're artificially inflated, and there are more cases because there's more testing, and which there isn't. I can attest to that. There's not a lot of testing in comparison with other countries. There's not near the amount of testing we need. But the problem is they're really undercounting the cases, the new cases, because even the tests we have a lot of false negatives. It's not false positive, it's false negatives. So you get a test, it's negative, and then it turns out, well, you really do have it, or you start getting sick later. Um, you can look at the deaths. I mean, there are all kinds of graphs. People are not wanting, I don't know what the reason is. They don't want to see it, or for some reason, we don't believe anything anymore. Even science counts, um, but you can go state to state to state on CDC website, NIH website, pick it, pick whatever you want, and it shows deaths per state, deaths by day per state. There's no fake deaths, okay? If they're dead, they're dead. And people have said, well, how do you test a dead person for COVID? How do you know it was COVID? Well, they're sick for a long time before they die. Generally, you don't just drop dead from COVID. You have very specific symptoms, and you have very specific lab tests that they do, and they can tell from blood from old lab tests. When they go back, they can pull up these blood, because they don't throw away the blood right away. They keep it, especially for a pandemic. They're keeping it for study, so they can go back and test the blood, and wow, yeah, they were positive for COVID. Or even if they weren't positive for COVID, you can look at an x-ray or a CT scan from somebody with COVID pneumonia, and without ever seeing a patient, you can tell that's COVID.
Mm.
The damage is unmistakable. It's very distinct. In my hotel, there was a radiologist who was not with Samaritans Purse. We had a lot of travel nurses and different staff from all over the country coming to New York. And we were on the elevator, both shell shocked after a shift, going to our rooms. And I just looked at him and said, have you ever seen x-rays in your career like this? And he said, nobody has. Nobody's seen them. The CT scans look like cauliflower growing in the lungs. It's very specific. So those are not lies. Though you can believe how many deaths per state, per day. You can look on all of these different sites. And I feel bad that people aren't believing that. I don't know what it takes to, well, I do. When people here start seeing the death and suffering that New York has gone through, I think they'll get it. I think they'll get it, unfortunately. Yeah.
One of the things that you shared with me and with others is that as people were coming home, their biggest prayer was that it wouldn't come back to their home state or their community.
Yeah. Every one of us as we're leaving. I really thought when I left California, I thought I was going to walk back into where New York was when I got there. Um, but the thing to remember was, or is, that we had already initiated the close down pretty soon after I left. They initiated lockdown, whatever you want to call it, social distancing, closing restaurants and things. That happened, and New York didn't do that right away. Well, actually, they did, but the rate, the reason the deaths went up so quickly, two things: they have a lot of people there. It's true, it's a city, very dense, but they they paid attention to it. They stayed in. They wore their masks. Um, they stayed off the streets. I stood in the middle of Fifth Avenue at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and took a picture in the middle of the street on the crosswalk. There was nothing, no cars, no people. So that's what it took to get where they are now. Their cases are down now, way down. When you look at our graph, we're still up here. We're just plateauing and under lockdown. So, yeah, we were all very, very afraid of that.
Thank you for sharing. If we were in person at our church doing this, I would pray over you. Would you mind if I say a prayer over Zoom for you?
I would love that.
And then I'm going to ask those that are watching this to also just pray over you during this time.
That would be awesome. Do you mind if I just read something really quick?
Yes.
Do we have time?
Yep.
Okay. So Isaiah 34:4 is another one of my go-tos. I sought the Lord, and he answered me. He delivered me from all my fears. That is so true. It's so true. And then 7, the angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him, and he delivers them. And that word encamped with all the tents just really hit home to me all the time. So yes, I will take prayer.
Yeah. Let me pray for you. God, thank you for my sister, my friend Ann. God, she used the word weary to describe what it was like. And we just pray for her, God. We pray in your scriptures, it says that you'll give us strength to fly on wings like eagles. Just pray that for Ann. We also pray that you would continue to encamp around her and fill her with your spirit. For your blessing on her and her family, God. God, we also pray against this virus spreading. You are sovereign and you have the power. So we pray that you would stop it. God, help us to be wise also. Pray for wisdom. Pray this in your name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you, Ann.
You're welcome. Anytime.